Thanks very much for coming along tonight, folks. Good to see you here. And thanks very much to the Clean Energy Council and Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. It's really nice to be doing this event with them, and also to the other speakers who are here tonight. We're having this conversation because we've got a state election in November. One of the very strong themes at the state elections is going to be about jobs. We're also having this conversation because there's an enormous opportunity. We know about the challenge. John briefly mentioned the challenge of climate change. And we know that it's an overwhelming and enormous challenge. We're not going to dwell on that tonight, though. What we're going to talk about is the opportunity tonight. And sometimes in Australia, you get the feeling that we don't understand that this is an enormous economic opportunity, that renewable energy is a really powerful industry globally. In 2012, there was $227 billion worth of investment in renewable energy globally, compared with 148 billion in fossil fuels. So significantly more investment in renewable energy than fossil fuel projects. That's only slightly smaller than the entire Victorian economy, the gross state product of Victoria. And renewable energy will overtake, investment in renewable energy will overtake investment and all economic activity in Victoria in the very near future. Individual technologies are going gangbusters. Solar PV, solar photovoltaic, last year 37 gigawatts was installed. This year it's predicted to increase by 35% to 49 gigawatts. Australia has 60 gigawatts of generation in total. So again, just the amount of solar PV being installed is likely to overtake Australia's, well, in 1 year, the amount of generating capacity is likely to increase Australia's entire capacity fairly shortly. Energy efficiency is a $370 billion industry globally at the moment. So we're talking, our politicians sometimes are looking at this industry, thinking of it as it was in the 70s, as a cottage industry. It's serious business. In Australia, 24,000 people are employed in the renewable energy industry. And under our renewable energy target nationally, which we all know will need to be strengthened over time, we know we need a lot more renewable energy investment than that, but it's predicted that it will encourage $36 billion worth of investment in renewable energy by 2020. So very large amounts of investment. We're not getting our share of that investment in Victoria today. So this is work that was done by the Climate Change Authority. So Victorians make up 25% roughly of the national population. We've so far achieved 15% of the investment under the renewable energy target. So instead of being on track for a $9 billion share of that $36 billion worth of investment, we're looking at more like $6 billion of projects. We're missing out on $3 billion of new renewable energy projects in Victoria if we continue on that path. We're seeing other states outpace us. Victoria was leading the nation not so long ago. Many of you would be familiar with the Victorian Renewable Energy Targets, which was the first mandated renewable energy target at the state level in the country. It was added to our policy mix when the federal government, then Howard government, didn't increase the national target. We were on a 2% national target for many years. So Victoria led the way and really drove investment. Now you can see, particularly in the small-scale renewable sphere, that states like Queensland and South Australia and WA are really outpacing us when it comes to installation of small-scale renewable energy. On a per capita basis, again, it looks pretty bad. South Australia really leading the way with solar PV. Not surprisingly, some of the northern states and with warmer weather outpacing us on solar hot water. But our market in solar hot water has been declining in recent years when it really needs to be expanding. South Australia is now getting around a third of its electricity from renewable energy. Victoria's sitting on around 5%. So, they're really making the most of the federal policy settings that exist, and are also introducing complementary and supportive state-based policies. And we know that a lot of the policy settings are national policy settings when it comes to renewable energy. So we're going to have a state election. Some of the politicians might like to think, well, we've got the policy settings in Canberra, we can forget about doing anything in Victoria. But we also know that state advocacy for policy measures, energy efficiency measure, policy measures like the carbon price, policy measures like the Renewable Energy Target, like the Climate Change Authority, like ARENA, like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation are really important. Maybe we should say no. No, it's not really working, is it?
I think we'll just have to, sorry about that. The lights are off a little bit.
Okay. So it's important that Victoria has a strong voice nationally in advocating for strong climate policy and strong renewable energy policy. But there's plenty that we can be doing at the state level. And so we're going to talk about some of these ideas. I'm going to be talking at the broader level. Tim's going to go into some nearer term opportunities that are perhaps much easier to achieve. So we need to start removing some of the obstacles and the barriers to renewable energy investment in Victoria. Some of these barriers include things like difficulty in accessing the grid for both small-scale and large-scale renewable energy projects. We've been astonished by the number of calls we've had from both households and businesses who are being told by their electricity distributors that no, sorry, you can't install a 6 kilowatt PV system on your roof, you can have a 2 kilowatt system. Or businesses that want to install a 40 or 50 kilowatt solar PV system and being told by the distributor, no, you can have a 10 kilowatt system. And there's significant delays and expense involved in the process. We need to revisit the solar feed-in tariff in Victoria, which doesn't properly value solar's contribution to the grid. It's a difficult conversation to work out what the right value is, but it's certainly not what solar is currently being paid. And the largest barrier to us achieving our share of the renewable energy target is the wind farm laws, which were introduced by the Bailey government back in 2011. We've got a ridiculous situation that this slide shows, where that red area is an exclusion zone for wind farms around the town of Morwell. It's a 5 kilometre exclusion zone where you are not allowed to build a wind farm. And yet the fire was burning 500 metres from Wallace Street in Morwell, where residents were copping the smoke for weeks, and in fact are still copping a fair bit. It's really important that we get some sophisticated approaches to harmonising and locating wind farms within communities. This is the crudest approach in the nation. It's irrational policy making, it's discriminatory against one of our lowest cost forms of renewable energy. So what are some of the go buttons that we should be pushing? Where do the green lights need to come from? We can have government funding to support new renewable energy technologies, particularly less mature technologies like wave and tidal power, for instance. So a new round of energy technology innovation strategy funding dedicated to renewable energy projects. If you look at the funding that's gone into the energy technology, energy innovation strategy in Victoria over the past 7 or 8 years, over 2/3 of it has gone into fossil fuel projects and around 1/3 into renewable energy projects. We shouldn't be funding innovation, using innovation funding to fund polluting projects. We should be flipping that balance. We need to be investing in skills and training. The previous state government had a green jobs agenda, really important. And there's folks here from Earthworker tonight, again, really important that we're getting the right skills and training, things like the Plumbing Industry Advisory Centre, where plumbers are being trained in units of green plumbing We need the same thing for the renewable energy industry. We could use a revolving fund for grid connection to support some of those costs, particularly for large projects in areas that are in constrained areas of the grid. Tim's going to talk about energy storage, and there's other experts in the room on energy storage here tonight. Real opportunity to combine energy storage technologies and make Victoria a leader in energy storage with technologies like solar and wind. It's really important. If we need to bring online renewable energy, we're going to hear a little bit more tonight about energy demand falling, a really good news story about energy demand falling in Victoria and right around the nation. To create space for renewable energy investment, we actually need to be retiring coal generation. And we've seen the problems most emphatically at Hazelwood recently. We know that Anglesea is up for sale later this year. We know that companies like AGL are saying there's 9 gigawatts oversupply of baseload generation in the national electricity markets. We need some leadership. We need to revisit where we've been in the past, where we've been starting to have a conversation around retirement dates and closure dates for some of our oldest and dirtiest coal-fired power stations. And we need to get really serious about solar hot water. And I mentioned that the market's actually been in decline in Victoria in the past 5 years. We've gone from 5 years ago installing 45,000 solar hot water systems to 18,000 in 2012. It's a really important technology. It complements solar PV, which is shaving our need for electricity at the peaks with reducing the overnight load. If we could increase our solar water heating share to 30% of Victorian homes over the next decade, that would require tripling our annual installations of solar hot water to 57,000 systems a year, and it would create 1,500 new permanent jobs in Victoria. So that's more jobs than we're going to lose down at Geelong at the Ford factory. Very significant job opportunities, and a lot of them would be in manufacturing. A lot of them would be in the southeastern suburbs, out in places like Dandenong, which are really being pressed by the loss of manufacturing jobs. It's a really big opportunity for us. So I'm going to conclude here. And I think there's a challenge for us to think about how we communicate the opportunities in the renewable energy industry. And we've got to accept that there are some people who have a fetish for hard hats. But we can show plenty of images and video and footage of renewable energy industry hard hat jobs. Politicians love hard hats. There's plenty of them to be had, but there's also a more sophisticated market that we need to communicate clearly the job benefits around. And the final comment I want to make is that we've only talked about renewable. I'm only talking about renewable energy jobs here tonight. But there is an enormous opportunity around energy efficiency. The biggest opportunity around energy efficiency in Victoria, and we're doing quite a lot of work in this space, is around improving the energy efficiency of our existing buildings. And there's a very big opportunity around increasing the performance of our existing homes. And again, there are thousands of jobs in that. We've done modelling which looks at improving the efficiency of the 1.7 million homes we have in Victoria that are currently less than 2 stars. Most people in Victoria are living in a house that's rated at less than 2 stars. If we could increase that average to 5 stars, we'd be creating between 5,000 and 7,000 jobs on the modelling that we've done. Really big opportunity again. Jobs spread through the suburbs, lots of tradesman jobs, lots of manufacturing jobs, and huge cost savings, huge emissions reductions, huge water savings, lots of jobs. We need to be doing it all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. The next speaker is Tom Sonnreich from the Clean Energy Council, who will be talking about the work the Council's been doing on detailed analysis of opportunities. Tim is responsible for designing and implementing the Clean Energy Council's advocacy and engagement strategies. Prior to joining the CEC, Tom worked for 5 years as a political advisor in the Victorian Government, including a stint as Senior Advisor for Environment, Climate Change and Innovation to former Premier John Brumby. Tim, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Let me just start also by thanking Mark and Environment Victoria. It's great. They were very keen when this idea first started to get formed to do something. The forum was put together, very quickly, as tends to happen when people get excited about stuff. And we were very pleased to have their support tonight. So thanks, Mark, and of course to the MSSI for helping us with a great venue. So very quickly about the Clean Energy Council, in case you haven't come across us before, we're the peak industry body for the renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors. We've got about 550 odd members, so it changes on a slightly hourly basis, but anyway, it's about 550. And they range from, really, really big guys like GE and Siemens and those kind of guys, big multinational, international companies, right down to hundreds of small and medium-sized businesses that do things like install solar PV and solar hot water systems or do household energy efficiency upgrades. So we're an industry organisation, we're entirely funded by our members, but we sort of span the genre of kind of big and small industries, and we work across just about every clean energy technology you could think of. So part of the reason for tonight coming about was based on a bit of a thought experiment we were doing in the office, because that's the kind of nerds that we are. And we thought to ourselves, we're reading in the papers about all the announcements about job losses in particular sectors, and we thought, well, what's the job potential in Victoria? And we thought, well, we could probably come up with a pretty big number if we kind of put together all the different technologies we work on. But then we decided, but there's no point generating a giant number, which might get us a day's worth of media attention, but no one in kind of serious government policy land is going to take that too seriously. They're going to say, well, yeah, okay, but in the world we live in right now, there's a few constraints on policy. The first is there can't be any additional cost to consumers. That's a no-no. If you've got any policy idea that adds $1 to someone's electricity bill or any other bill, you're dead before you finish the conversation. So none of that. We definitely can't have any new regulations on business, and we're a chamber of commerce, so we get that. We don't want to tie up businesses in red tape because my members are businesses. They don't like red tape either. So yep, can't have any of that. And it's got as close to zero new spending as is humanly possible. You can get some conversation going about a little bit of money, but it's got to be a really little amount. So okay, so let's take all of that, and let's assume that there's an election this year, so everybody's thinking very short term. What can we announce that's going to do some stuff maybe in the next 6 or 12 or 18 or at most maybe 24 months? Let's kind of put all that together and see whether that leaves us with anything of any substance at all. And the good news is, it left us with lots. I'm going to talk about 3 tonight just because I don't have time to do all the ones, but we're working on a paper which we'll put out in a couple of weeks' time, which goes by the now familiar title of Quick Clean Energy Jobs for Victoria. So tonight's a bit of a trial run for some of those. You're getting a sneak peek of some of our latest thinking. So the first one, and this sort of follows on from some stuff that Mark was saying about solar hot water. Victoria is really the place to be having the conversation about solar hot water because Victoria is the national home of the solar hot water industry, and just as politicians have a bit of a fetish for hard hats, they love manufacturing jobs, and we love manufacturing jobs too, especially if they're members of ours. And as it turns out, Victoria has tons and tons of manufacturing jobs in solar hot water. The 2 big ones are Ream, who are based in Moorabbin and manufacture a number of different solar water heating technologies there, and Everlast, who are in Dandenong, who I think have a partnership with the Earthworker folks, who we might hear a bit more from later on. So they do direct manufacturing, all the real jobs that newspapers and politicians and journalists love, people bolting things together. They do that stuff there. But they also do, as you can see from our quick case study of Ream, all sorts of other jobs in all kinds of other areas, but people mostly focus on those jobs in the manufacturing side. But solar hot water's had a pretty tough run, and look, in many ways it's a difficult technology. It faces a number of barriers to uptake, and the first is that you just have to acknowledge, because it's simply a fact, that solar hot water has a higher upfront cost than other kinds of water heating technology like all electric systems or all gas systems. And that's simply true, that they cost more to install, and the costs of them are a bit more variable because you have to balance having the right tank size for the right property, and it depends a bit on the type of house you're in and all those sorts of things. So in simple terms, a kind of average hot water system, you might get a gas system, might cost you $1,500 or $2,000 for a family home, and it can easily cost you twice that much to get a solar hot water system. So that's a pretty big barrier. And that leads to the second issue, which is the way in which people make decisions about solar hot water, particularly replacement solar hot water figures. And my old boss at the council used to say that people make decisions about buying a replacement water heater system at 6 o'clock in the morning when they're cold, wet, and naked. And it's not an ideal decision-making matrix. People tend to want hot water to come back on very, very quickly. They tend to be not in a very good mood. And when they call up a plumber and say, I've got no hot water, the plumber says, well, sure, I can put something in for you. What have you got right now? And they say, oh, I think I've got a 3-star or a 4-star gas system, or I've got a gas electric system, whatever it might be. And I say, sure, I can give you exactly the same one as that again this afternoon. And that's as far as the conversation goes. And if it ever gets to the question of, would you like a solar hot water system, the guy might say, sure, I can do you one, but it's going to cost you about $2,000 more. And the cold, wet, naked person says, just give me the one I got. And that's what happens. And so less than 1% of the replacement market for water heaters in Australia, and in Victoria as well, come from the solar hot water sector. And because people tend to replace like with like, because people don't install solar hot water, they replace with solar hot water. And that becomes a huge issue. But look, there's also some other competing problems. There's the issue of what we call the competition for rooftop real estate. Most people don't have giant rooftops that can have both solar hot water and solar PV, especially if they want a fairly big solar PV system. So they tend to choose. Their kind of solar investment is to get one or the other. And particularly in the days where there were feed-in tariffs and other things around for solar PV, it was a pretty hard task to convince people that they should use some of that precious rooftop space for solar hot water when the returns from solar PV were so much quicker. So all of that adds up to what Mark was saying, which is that the rate of installations has come down. And this graph kind of tells the story that the national story is worse than the Victorian story in terms of the gradient of that decline. And that's simply because the only thing which is propping up the solar hot water industry in Victoria is the fact that the 5-star and now the 6-star standard in Victoria requires that new homes have either a solar hot water system or a rainwater tank installed, and somewhere around 60% of homes are installing a solar hot water system to comply with that code. And if you remove that, this graph would be very, very close to a straight line running along the bottom. So it's bad, and it's actually worse than it looks. If it wasn't for that 6-star requirement, you probably wouldn't have Ream or Everlast manufacturing in Victoria, and you probably wouldn't have too many of the companies actually selling and retailing in Victoria. So that's a problem. But it's also an opportunity because that capacity is there. Those factories exist, at least for the moment, and if we could increase demand, we could very quickly increase the number of folks who work in those factories. So here's an interesting story. Victoria is unique in all Australian jurisdictions in that it pays households an energy concession or a payment to help low-income households to pay their electricity bill in a special way. In every other state, if you are on a low income and the government's helping you pay your electricity bills, you get a lump sum. They're different amounts. In New South Wales, it's about $250 for summer and $250 for winter, and sometimes they tweak those amounts. They go up, usually around election time, but they're fixed amounts. In Victoria, the concessions are paid on a proportional basis of 17.5% of your electricity bill summer and winter. And the reason why that's important is, firstly, from a social policy perspective, it means that if your bills skyrocket in a given year, the value of that government support stays relatively the same. It's 17% of a larger amount, so the government support maintains its kind of its size in relation to your bills. So that's really important from a social policy perspective. But from an economic policy perspective, what makes it important is there's the potential for a win-win. Because if governments can help low-income households to reduce their electricity bills, they win as well. They have a lower electricity bill, which means they pay 17.5% of a lower amount, which is itself a lower amount, and so everybody's a winner. The householder gets lower bills, the government saves money directly off the budget bottom line, but nobody is worse off. In fact, everybody is better off. So it's the ultimate win-win opportunity. And so we, with our friends from ATA, who you'll hear from in a sec, did a bit of a modelling exercise to have a look at what that is. And the graph up here shows you the purple line there is the amount of money that the Victorian government spends on electricity concessions just on the water heating component of that bill. So it's a bit of an average, right? The average household uses about a third of its electricity to heat water. And so 17.5% of that third equals those amounts. And you can see that over time, and not over a particularly huge amount of time, over the next, probably the term either that this government will run or the length of time the next government will run, that bill is going to go through the roof. And it's going to go through the roof because households are getting bigger, they're using more hot water, and also more and more households are getting on the electricity concession system. So the concession program is growing because more households are joining it and they're using more power and more water heating. So that's a real problem. I can't see governments being willing in Victoria to infinitely expand the energy concession program to maintain it. So one of a couple of different things has to happen. Either A, people have to get forced out of the energy concession program, and that's bad because that means poor people are not getting help to pay their bills, or the energy concession program has to become less generous, and that's bad because it means poor people get less help to pay for their bills, or we have to find a way to reduce the cost of the energy concession program without hurting those people it's intended to help. Well, we've got a plan, and that plan is install solar hot water in the households of low-income people who are eligible for the concession. And based on some work ATA did, there's roughly about 70,000 hot water systems replaced each year in Victoria alone in households that are eligible to get the concession. So that's a potential market size of 70,000. And that graph we did before, I'll just flick back to that. Oop, just revealed my next slide. That graph we did 3 scenarios. That's the green, red, and blue line. I'm going to talk about the red line because that was our middle scenario, and that is to install 20,000 hot water systems a year in low-income homes, which is roughly about the number of systems we install in Victoria now. So it's kind of a doubling of the market. And if you do that, as you can see from the summary slide there, you make a gross saving of $45 to $76 million, depending on which of those you take up. And if you took the most aggressive scenario over a 10-year period, you save $150 million off the government's bottom line. And that comes straight off funds which the Treasury Department has already projected it will need to spend. So that's a direct government saving. It's the kind of thing treasurers should love. And at the same time, it creates lots and lots and lots of jobs. There's 3 ways to fund it. I don't have time to really explain them in much detail, except to say there's a couple of different ways. There's a thing called the Greener Government Building Program, which still exists in Victoria, that had some changes last week, which is where the Treasury lends money at a pretty low rate to departments. Those government departments can then invest that money in energy efficiency upgrades, and then they pay the Treasury back based on the savings that they get in that department from the energy and water savings. At the moment, that program wouldn't allow for our hot water idea to be used, but the government could always change that, and it would cost them nothing to make that change. The problem with that is it means that government departments are borrowing more money, so it does mean an increase in government debt. No one likes that idea very much, so here's another idea. The Office of Housing could take a borrow to invest model, and the reason why that's different is because the Office of Housing is what's called a non-financial public sector entity. So in budget speak, that means when the government, whoever the government is, wants to release its budget and it wants to say, we have a surplus in Victoria of X millions of dollars, that surplus amount doesn't include debt obligations of the non-financial public sector entities. Whole of government debt, net government public sector debt does include it, but the most important calculation that journalists care about, which is the budget in deficit or surplus, isn't affected. So that's cool. Or finally, there's another idea we've looked at, which is social impact bonds, which is where the private sector invests in any kind of program which has a social outcome. In this case, it's helping low-income households to save money. There is an agreed kind of set of results that need to be delivered by that program, and if the private sector is successful, the government pay them a reward payment. If they're unsuccessful, the government doesn't pay them anything, and the households that were helped under the program keep the help they get. So it's pretty low risk for government, low cost. Let's move on and talk about another opportunity, and that's solar PV. And everybody likes to talk about solar PV, so I couldn't get away tonight without saying something about solar PV. And the easy thing we could have said was just have a feed-in tariff and people will go berserk and buy solar, and they would. But going back to our thought experiment, no extra cost to consumers. So what are we going to do to increase solar PV? Well, there's a big slice of the market in Victoria which is underserved. And I came up with what I think is a pretty snazzy graph, which shows you how to do that. And where those 3 circles, money is how rich you are, space is do you have the rooftop space to put solar PV panels on, because some people don't, myself included, for example. And title, do you own your property, or do you have the legal rights to make modifications to your property, or essentially are you renting or in some kind of public or social housing? And if you have all 3 of those, and that doesn't necessarily mean in the money sense that you're super rich, but if you have a fair bit of money and you have a little bit of space and you've got title, then you're the kind of person who's already got solar. You're the kind of person who probably used a feed-in tariff as your incentive to go out and slap solar on your roof. Good for you, you're great. That's where all those figures that Mark talked about come from. But if you're in one of these other sectors that I've pointed to here, you probably don't have solar because you're missing one of the key ingredients that you need at the moment to buy solar. Either you don't have enough money, that's a pretty obvious problem. You don't have the space, that's a real problem. Or you do have the money and you do have the space, but you're renting, so there's not much you can do about it. If we could find ways to help those 4 underserved markets to get access to solar PV, then we could greatly expand the amount of solar PV that's going into Victoria without having to use things like feed-in tariffs, although feed-in tariffs would help, but they're not necessary. So, how do we do it? Well, each of those 3 groups can have policies by the government which don't breach any of our thought experiment rules. The first one is the government could assist public housing tenants to either purchase or lease solar hot water systems, and all they're required to do, they don't have to spend $1 on it, all they need to do is set up what's called 3-way contracts. So the issue is, in public housing, the government is the landlord. So they own the house, but the tenant wants to either buy or lease solar PV. So they go to a solar company. The solar company says, sure, we'll lease you solar or we'll sell you a solar system, but you need to have, as signing on to this contract, the owner of the property. So the government comes up with a set of rules under which circumstances they will be willing to sign on to a three-way lease or purchase agreement where all of the obligation for maintaining and ownership of the system lies with the person who is the tenant, but the legal obligation is ticked off. And the South Australian government started doing this 2 years ago. There's about 250 public housing tenants in South Australia that have purchased solar PV systems, and they're now moving on to trialling the leasing model. And all the government's done is be willing to sign on to the contracts, and they did some work to develop what a model contract needs to look like. So what are the terms and conditions which they think are fair both to the government and the tenants, and if you can meet those requirements, they'll sign on. And the government's plan is to trial the leasing model, and then if it works, to roll it out to 5,000 households in South Australia. There's a lot more public housing tenants than that in Victoria, so you can do the math for yourself. The second one is that we could assist private renters or low-income private owners to access solar through leasing agreements. And again, this is the same proposition, except the government doesn't need to be involved, so it doesn't have to sign on as a third-party tenant, but it does need to make sure that anytime you're dealing with helping low-income people to buy things which are relatively expensive for them, you want to make sure that their proper consumer protections are there. So we think it'd be important for the government to work with the consumer affairs bodies and with its own fair trading organisations to make sure that there were model and template solar leasing contracts that protected low-income households. And we have seen, unfortunately, some evidence that some of the less savoury end of the market are looking to get into the solar leasing game with, let's say, contracts which aren't ideal. Or finally, we could provide incentives for relatively well-off people to buy solar. And this seems weird. Why do we need incentives for rich people to do anything? And it's usually because they don't have the rooftop space. And if they don't have rooftop space but they have money, then they're a great untapped market. And the easiest way to help rich people who want to invest in solar but don't have an appropriate roof to do it themselves is to help set up things like community-owned solar models. And I think we'll hear a bit about that in a sec. And there's a couple of different forms of community ownership. I won't go into them now, but you can ask me a question at the end if you like about the difference between generator models and offset models, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. But that's the answer.
About 3 or 4 minutes.
Cool, that's perfect. So the last one I want to talk about is bulk energy storage. And the reason why I want to talk about bulk energy storage as opposed to just energy storage is the conversation in energy nerd circles is all about storage these days, but when people say storage, they tend to mean batteries. And batteries are great. Lots of my members sell batteries. We'd like to see them sell even more batteries. But there is a whole other end of the spectrum of the debate, and that's the bulk end. And this fancy little graph which one of our members put together, and you can see their little trademark logo up the top there, but it's still a good graph, so I use it all the time. Shows you the kind of span of different technologies and their different applications. So batteries are great, but they tend to be clustered in that kind of middle part of the chart in terms of the types of services that they can provide to people and the types of benefits they have. But right up there in the end, in the corner, you've got the bulk energy storage systems. And these are the systems that can store hours of energy at very, very large scale. So these are the things you can use to kind of back up wind and solar plants to give them kind of total flexibility about when they generate. And so these are really important because while it's often overstated that things like wind and solar are unreliable, they're not unreliable. In fact, they're highly predictable. But nevertheless, there is a limit to how much wind and solar you can have in the market at the moment. It's a lot higher than we have right now, but there is a limit. And to help us push through that limit to the next level, what we mostly need is bulk energy storage. So the two main ones are compressed air and pumped hydro. We already know what pumped hydro looks like because we've got lots of it. The Snowy Hydro Scheme, the Tasmanian Hydro Scheme are all pumped hydro, so you probably already know what that is. Compressed air is really a quite simple idea. It's about setting up effectively industrial scale air compressors, either over a man-made object like a big concrete tube, or you can use depleted gas wells or salt caverns or all kinds of other geological formations, and you use electricity that's cheap, like overnight wind power that doesn't have a market. Use that to run your compressor, pump your cavern, whatever it is, full of air, and then when you want to create electricity, you release that air, and the air runs up through a turbine, turns a turbine, creates power, Bob's your uncle, clean energy. We don't have any of that in Victoria, and so very quickly our proposal is that the EDIS program, which Mark also mentioned, currently has about $40 million unspent. There's never been a funding round for the EDIS program in the last 3 years, so that money's just sitting there. We'd like to see, I don't know, let's say $500,000 spent on developing a bulk energy storage plan. It's very cheap, it's money that's already sitting there. What a bulk energy storage plan is up there on the board, and I won't read it out because I'm out of time, but we think it could be a very important way to create a new niche industry in Victoria doing, high-tech, interesting, hard hat type things, but things which also will greatly improve the ability for us to get extra performance out of our existing renewable energy and to make it very smooth for us to integrate large amounts of new renewable energy. So that's what we've got. Last slide is in the paper that we're developing. There's lots of other technologies we're looking at. That's the list. Hopefully they'll all make it into the final paper. I don't have time to talk about any of those tonight, but hopefully we'll get as good ideas for them as we've had for the first three. Thanks for coming along tonight.
Okay, all sorts of topics for further conversation there. Thank you, Tim. We're now going to move to ask two people, Craig Memery and Mike Sandiford, to add a little further to this discussion. First of all, I'm going to introduce Craig, who's the Energy Market Specialist and Consumer Advocate with the Alternative Technology Association. So I'll get you to talk for 8 minutes, if that's all right, and I'll give you a hurry up after 3 or 4.
Thanks very much. Hi everyone. So I've been asked to fill in at first for Taryn, who was going to talk to us about community energy as well as doing my own presentation. Taryn's a lot more pleasant than I am, but I'll do my best to fill that gap. I've also been asked to be quick, so being pleasant and quick, two things that don't come naturally to me, but I'll do my best. So first, community energy. What is it? Well, it's, as Tim alluded to, it's energy projects that are owned by communities rather than big businesses. In short, they include all sorts of projects. They can be wind, they can be solar. There's over 50 communities around Australia at the moment who are trying to get community energy projects happening. 2 have been successful. They include Hepburn Wind, which is a wind farm in Victoria, which was one of the groundbreaking community energy projects. And the potential people who are involved in these communities include those poor rich apartment owners without their own roofs over their heads that Tim referred to as well. I mean, what sort of jobs can these projects bring about if they go ahead? Well, we're talking about a lot of jobs involved in the development, building and maintaining of potentially hundreds of megawatts of wind and solar project. As Mark said, not just the hard hat jobs, but a lot of the jobs behind the scenes that are involved in making those projects a reality. They're also quite local jobs, and if there's consistent growth in that sector, there'll be long-term jobs as well. But what are the sort of barriers that we need to overcome to get that growth in the sector and make those jobs long-term? Well, community energy faces a bunch of challenges that other types of energy projects don't necessarily face, and some of those are to do with scale, and most of those are surmountable with the right sort of policy changes. They include accessing a fair price for the energy that is sold to the grid. Community energy projects sort of sit in this limbo nether region between small-scale residential projects that are entitled to feed-in tariffs and large-scale projects that can just compete on the basis of scale to get a good price. So we need something like a feed-in tariff for those projects. It doesn't need to be a subsidy that costs other consumers more, it just needs to lock in a fair price. The ACT government has actually gone down the route of developing a feed-in tariff for community-scale projects. Another issue that's faced by community projects is accessing the startup funding to go through the development and early stage of their projects. Finding sites, developing a business and a model. It's a high-risk activity, but with that risk diversified over a lot of projects, it actually becomes low risk. If there's a funding pool that allows those community bodies to start to progress those projects at the early stage, it means that more projects can be made a reality and at a small actual cost if it's a rolling fund. Hepburn Wind actually had enjoyed some startup capital supported with support of Sustainability Victoria and RDV, which helped them get to that point. Such a program could be linked to a state-based community renewable energy target, for example. We're facing a bit of uncertainty about the future of the renewable energy target. Victoria has a history of saying, well, the national energy target's not enough, so we'll develop our own one. It's been done before. Community energy projects would be a great opportunity to specifically target a type of renewable energy investment that had really local benefits with a target like that. Another thing Mark referred to before, the VC82 rules, which prohibit you from putting wind turbines in sensible places for no good reason. And if we actually change that, at least specifically for community energy projects, would potentially help improve that situation. Community energy projects are particularly unfairly targeted by that rule because they tend to be quite localised, quite small, and nearer to the end of the grid, which is where homes are. They're also smaller in scale, so they don't have the visual impact that large-scale wind farms are perceived to have if there's only 2 or 3 turbines, yet they're still restricted by the same rules that impact larger developments. How am I going for time?
3 or 4 minutes left.
Okay, great. The other thing I'd like to talk about is the potential for people to move away from gas where they currently use it, and also the potential for people to not use gas. Now, there's a lot of jobs in this opportunity as well. So now we're cooking with gas, but should we actually be doing that? Gas isn't any longer the cheap, clean and safe fuel option that it once was for some consumers, at least, or for a lot of consumers, for space heating and hot water and cooking. So there's 2 main reasons for this. One is that the efficiency of electric devices to do the same has improved dramatically. We've got heat pumps to heat our hot water. We've got electric boosted solar that's a lot more efficient than gas or electric heating generally. We've also got induction cooktops which are able to provide a similar amenity to gas, some say even better, and they can operate quite efficiently as well. All of those can be supplied by electricity. If you ditch all of them, you also don't have to have a gas connection any longer and pay fixed gas fees. The other aspect of gas becoming a less favourable fuel source is that we're opening up a gas export market in Australia, which over the next few years is going to see domestic, residential domestic in particular, gas prices go through the roof. So the economics of it all has shifted. And in fact, ATA are doing some research at the moment on this. We expect to have some publicity around our results and findings in the next few months. But basically it's pointing at the fact that in many states of Australia, the time is now for consumers to stop connecting gas to new homes when they build them, and potentially to start thinking about how they move away from gas when they have it at the moment. Either when their next appliance fails and they're in the shower freezing at 6 in the morning and naked. Maybe one solution to the problem that Tim raised there would be to have stickers that you put on shower screens that say, stop, are you cold, naked and shivering and wet? Before you call the plumber, do this. And one option we expect in future will be don't reinstall a gas system because it's not the cheap option you once thought it was. How do we actually get away from not just get away from the gas-dominated world that we're in, but enable consumers and empower them to do what's best for them in the long term by choosing electricity when it's a better option? One is, as a state, we could stop pouring millions of taxpayer dollars into expanding gas pipelines to towns and regional centres. Also, new estates currently get paid significant amounts, the developers get paid significant amounts to connect gas to new blocks, even though in the case of residents that's actually locking them in to a higher cost in the long term. So it's the state government now giving money to developers to make life more expensive for householders in the long run. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it looks a bit like a handout to industry. Also, we could expand the state government winter warmers subsidy. So there's a state government concession for low-income households, which is a great idea. It exists historically to get them off resistance electric heating and onto gas heating where it was cheaper, but it doesn't actually, it's not extended to heat pump-based options like split systems. So that concession should be expanded to those particular businesses. We could preserve, in fact expand even, the Victorian Energy Efficiency Target, which has come under some pretty thinly veiled threats recently by government, and expand it and make sure it includes all the more efficient electric technologies where they exist. And finally, we need to make sure that consumers are provided with up-to-date and relevant information, because really what we've got is a paradigm shift. The old conventional logic of gas being cheap is just not likely to be true any longer, and it's going to take a lot of work to actually get consumers to understand that one. When we can overcome those, there's potentially a lot of jobs waiting in installing and supplying, and as Tim mentioned, manufacturing those new devices, particularly hot water, but also electric air conditioning systems and induction cooktops.
I'd now like to ask Mike Sandiford to add some further reflections on the employment potential of renewable energy. Mike, again, many of you will know, is Professor of Geology and Director of the Melbourne Energy Institute here at the University of Melbourne.
Well, thanks very much. Actually, I don't want to say anything about renewable energy. Other than say, you would say that, wouldn't you? You would say that the jobs are in the clean energy sector, but look where the jobs are. They're in the old traditional way of making electricity and providing energy. And it's served Victoria well, hasn't it? So why would you want to shift? Of course now, especially now, you know, it's tough times out there in the job world. Well, so why don't we shine a light on what's happening in the way we are delivering electricity to Victorians, and what it's likely to do for jobs in the electricity sector as it stands today if we don't do anything, and what it might mean for jobs more broadly in Victoria, because that's the real nub of the question. You know, energy is there to serve our way of life. It's not an end in itself. You know, it should be supporting productivity, growth, opportunity across the sector. So if you step back a bit and have a look at our energy system and the way it's functioning, it's built on a model, a very simple business model. We'll provide you with more electrical power and we'll grow our business through that mechanism. And this is a graph of electricity demand as served by poles and wires in Victoria, actually dispatched by the National Electricity Market. The average demand measured in gigawatts on the vertical axis by year for the year to the end of March. So this is the most recent figures, just showing what's happened. Up until about 2008, 2009, the old business model was working fabulously well. Each year we were consuming about 1.5% more electricity. That was the growth in the jobs in the sector. We needed more people to provide those jobs, that electricity. That's the growth model. That's where the jobs are going. Of course, around about that time we had the GFC and things started to change, so we had a bit of a drop. If you looked at the projections for the future growth, every year since 2008, everyone in the business has been projecting it would go back to 1.5% to 2% growth. And every year they've been wrong. But what's going to happen next year? Well, we've just heard that we're going to lose 350 megawatts of electric power next year in Victoria in one closure, Point Henry. 7% of Victorian electricity consumption is going to disappear like that. That's not talking about the Fords and the Holdens, etc., the downturn in the industrial sector. So it's almost impossible to conceive that we're not headed on a trajectory down. Imagine closing Portland aluminium smelter. It's almost impossible to think that Portland aluminium smelter will be here in another 10 years. Looking at the global market for aluminium and the costs here, it's just inconceivable. So we're headed way down. It's not very far away where we'll be using less electricity across the poles and the wires than we were in the late 90s. That's the trajectory you're on. We can't break it. The old business model is out. There is no growth in jobs in providing electricity the way we have been doing it in this market. Okay, but what's it doing for the cost of electricity that's delivered to the major employment sector, the industrial sector? What's it doing for the cost? Well, to look at that, we have to look at what's happening to the infrastructure which is needed to serve this. And the infrastructure which serves this electricity is not dictated by how much we use on average, it's dictated by how much we use at peak times. And this is the growth in peak demand in electricity over the year to the end of March for Victoria. It's a bit more erratic than that average demand because it has a strong weather signal in it. Our peak demand was in January 29, 2009, 8 days before the bushfire, 10.4 gigawatts. Up until about that time, the peak demand was growing erratically, but growing at about 3.5%, much higher than our average demand. We were having to invest in the grid infrastructure to serve that electricity more than we were having to invest in the generation down in the Latrobe Valley, but not that much more. But what's happened since 2009? Well, we haven't seen any growth in electricity peak demand since then. We got pretty close this year, but we're nowhere near what we might have thought we would need back in 2009 in terms of serving electricity at the end of a very hot weather the summer. We might have thought we were up around 12 gigawatts. We've been building an infrastructure to serve a load which has never been realised. because electricity demand is falling and peak demand is not growing nearly at the rate we thought it was. Yet we have that infrastructure out there being built. How do we know we have that infrastructure out there being built? Because that's the major price rise on your electricity consumption. The amount of electrons we're pushing through the wires per capacity of the wires is falling at quite an alarming rate. I would just want to point this out. First of all, I'm going to take the ratio of the average demand to the peak demand. So the average demand we're seeing here is this. The peak demand is the red dots here. I'm going to take that average. That's a measure of how effectively we're using the grid infrastructure. And this is what's been happening to it. Back in the old days when demand was growing and peak demand was rising faster, average demand was rising, we were sitting at about 65 to 70% grid utilisation. But subsequently, that's been falling. It's down around 55% now. But the story is probably even worse than that in terms of grid utilisation, because in fact our grid capacity is somewhere way up here, somewhere in that triangle. We don't exactly know where, but we know it's up there because we're paying for it. That's the driver on our bills. How is that falling? Well, let's take the ratio, sorry I'm jumping around here, let's take the ratio of average demand to that dotted green line, which might be the upper bound on how much capacity our grid has in it. What's that been doing? There it is. Started off back around 70%, and it's been falling on a gentle line. That's the difference between the growth in peak demand at 3.5% and the growth in average demand at about 1.5%. But then then demand has started to fall. So we're now down at a utilisation rate of our grid at 45% capacity. That's a dramatic change in the way we're using our grid. It's becoming less and less productive all the time, and we're paying for it. The businesses that are employing us are paying for it. They're becoming less competitive. So not only are we losing jobs in the electricity sector by the way we're doing it, we're losing jobs, we will lose jobs in the future because the energy services, the model for energy services is becoming increasingly costly. So to put jobs back into Victoria, we actually have to try and get productivity back into our energy services. And the only way it seems to me to do that under the current regime is to start thinking about the end user, the demands the end user places on the grids. We have to have a very sharp focus on getting peak demand down, and that comes to distributed technologies. It comes to energy efficiencies. It comes to putting energy services distributed through the grid. If we can do that, we can get back to a situation where we're not facing this relentless decline in productivity of our energy infrastructure, which is going to drive a collapse in jobs. That's the place we have to go. Whether that's renewable, whether that's any other thing, it doesn't really matter from the jobs perspective. We have to get it right. And the old model seems to be falling apart. The old model of just producing more energy and we will soak it up is not working. And that's never an end in itself. It's all about services. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, so we're doing well for time. Thank you to all our speakers for being so disciplined. We now have 10 minutes or so, which is an opportunity for you to do two things. One is to ask a question in the normal way of any of the speakers, and if you do so, I'll probably ask them to jump up where they are, and I think we can probably pretty much talk to the audience from where they are, but if they want to come down, that's fine. But the second thing I'm inviting you to do, if you would like to, is a short, and I mean short, 60 seconds, perhaps a bit more, pitch of your own, a suggestion, an idea you have that's relevant to this topic, and which might be of interest to the speakers here tonight in terms of thinking about future policy directions. So, as I said, two opportunities, a question or a pitch. Do you want to... if you want to do a pitch, you probably should why don't you just come quickly down here? I think that's probably the best idea. And I'll drag you off after 90 seconds.
Okay. I hope it's the most exciting 90 seconds of your life. All right. So we like hard hats. We're Earthworker Cooperative, a partnership of unionists, in fact, militant unionists, through to small manufacturers, faith-based communities, etc. It's been a 16-year growth for us, discussions in the union movement and elsewhere. We've put a model in place where we manufacture here with the help of Everlast, Sidon Solar, Endless Solar, etc., using laser to install, laser plumbers. We're getting an Earthworker accreditation at the Plumbing Industry Climate Action Centre, so our installers will be Earthworker accredited. We sell the goods through the enterprise agreements that unions and employers negotiate. So as part of the wage increase, the worker can take the solar hot water system or our current new heat pump, the Sidon's heat pump. We're bringing jobs back from China. The heat pump's currently made in China, but we will be making the heat pump here, and we're starting off with the outer casing. So the distribution model is important. We also sell to Earthworker members, and we invite you all to join. Solar ready for replacements. The replacement market is big. We want to capture as much of that via what we manufacture here as possible. Solar ready is about halfway, the cost is about halfway between full solar and electric. Our heat pump doesn't take any heat roof space, so it's great in terms of combining with photovoltaic. We're talking to Tindu Solar in these 4 walls about getting a 1.5 system to deal with the 1 kilowatt that our heat pump would need to operate off photovoltaic on the roof.
20 seconds.
Star rating, we reckon future government, that's one thing we can address. Procurement we can address with the Napthine government gone. We can look at procurement for schools and other buildings where that's appropriate using the heat pump. So we think we've got the model, we've got the markets, so it's the unionised workforce and everyone covered by an EBA. It's the Earthworker membership. We're also doing deals with people like Reece and TradeLink and flying up to Sydney on Sunday with the Plumbing Cooperative, Supply Cooperative. So we think by pulling together this alliance across Australia of Australians with a view to putting manufacturing here of the green technologies is the way to go. Thank you.
Very good. And I'm sure you'd be happy to talk to people afterwards, I imagine. Okay, yeah, up there, up the back. Yeah.
This is a question for Tim. Do you think that Australia's clean technology and renewable energy products and expertise could get to the point where we actually start exporting it overseas?
Well, like I said before, my organisation represents a lot of different technologies, so the answer depends on which technology you mean in a way. We already do export a lot of expertise in one sense. Almost all of the world's biggest solar companies have either chief technology officers or chief research officers that are trained in Australia, most of them at the University of New South Wales School of Photovoltaics. So in that sense, we are already exporting our expertise in that sense, but in terms of exporting products, there's some scope for it, but the reality is the cost of transport from Australia and the volumes we'd be likely to get mean that things that are produced in Australia are primarily for a domestic market, although some of the solar hot water units that are made in Australia do get exported, so that does happen, and we could do more of that, but it's difficult for any policy settings in Australia to affect that particular example. I think it's really in the emerging technologies where that prospects are highest. And I didn't get a chance because of time and everything else to talk about things like marine energy, but marine energy is one of those, wave and tidal energy is one of those ones that's very underdeveloped internationally. It's still quite a new technology, and it's not clear yet who the kind of world leaders in marine energy are going to be. There are some places that are well ahead of us. The UK has got 2 test centres, one in Orkney in Scotland, and the other in, I can't remember where, somewhere else in the southwest of the UK where they do testing of marine energy technologies, and a number of companies that have trial projects in Australia actually have to go to the UK to test their products and then bring them back here and put them in Australia, which is kind of ridiculous. So there'd be good prospects if we wanted to be a kind of leader in those sort of areas. But in the established technologies like wind and solar, I think the answer is unlikely.
Mike, did you want to just add something to that?
There's a number of ways of thinking about this. Obviously, there's the manufacturing of the kit which is deployed, but there's also the control of the kit and the people, the organisations who want the energy services there. it's useful to have a look at what happens in the mining sector here in Australia. Obviously, we're a powerhouse internationally in the mining world, but we're a powerhouse in the mining services sector, and there's significant SMEs here in Victoria who build software to support that mining enterprise. You know, it's probably in that knowledge value area that we have a real opportunity to play, and that's one of the reasons to be out there in front, because when you're out there in front, you're inventing that, and that opportunity for Australia, for Victoria, is huge. We've got the rungs on the board in the mining sector, to be honest, we need to understand how do we play our hand effectively. Notwithstanding the fantastic research which has been done historically here in our research sector, photovoltaics, as I understand it, University of New South Wales still runs the world's most efficient PV, being about 40%. Here in Melbourne, consortium of CSIRO, University of Melbourne, and the Victorian Organic Solar Cell are printing PV on the same polymer that we have our blank magnets. Their ambition is just to print organic PV. Use it to cover your roof. Instead of having colour bomb, you'll have PV bomb. It won't be very efficient, but it'll be aesthetic, it'll be useful.
It's probably not a big job creator, but Australia does have one of the world's best systems for integrating large-scale wind into the grid. So the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, runs the market. Have you ever wondered why South Australia can sometimes get 50% of its power, but regularly gets about a quarter or a third of its power from wind, but never ever has blackouts attributed to wind energy, even though it's supposedly so unpredictable? It's because we actually have amazingly accurate forecasting technology, which AEMO developed over a number of years, which is now being exported. A number of other countries have come to Australia to learn about how their AEMO forecasting system works, because as an hour or two out from the generation point, that system's more than 95% accurate on predicting what the wind outcome will be, and 5 or 10 minutes out, which is the time frames that the energy market operate on 5-minute intervals, it's 98% accurate. So it's pretty awesome.
Craig, I'm going to get you to hold your point, just because I think there's a couple of other. Does this looks like a pitch? Okay, go for it.
And I hope my introduction isn't part of my 90 seconds.
I'll give you some.
I'm Margaret Reiser. I'm the chair of Mount Alexander Sustainability Group, which is a small group in central Victoria with a big ambition. I want to talk to you very briefly about a model that we have in conjunction with a private enterprise or outfit called Energy for the People, and that model works with the difference between the price without solar and the price with solar, in a way that that enables a community benefit to be returned. Now, I'll quickly say that model has two aspects. One is a donations one, where we essentially crowdsource. That's for organisations like childcare centres, for schools, for neighbourhood centres, and that's working with the community of that organisation, and it works on a donations basis, leveraging our DGR status. The second one is a very important one, and that is an investment model whereby we operate on a unit trust and we encourage people to invest, and that provides a return of 6 to 8%, which is better than my super fund. And that's actually one that we're working with to scale up in large areas. Tim, I take your point about the forgotten market in renewables, and that is poor people, that is aged care homes that don't have the capital, that is schools. There is a swathe nationally of people who frankly can't get into the solar market. We've been speaking to some of your members, that's engineering companies, and we've also been speaking to major superannuation funds and to financial institutions subject to an NDA, so I can't tell you the details. Very promising, and that's for a national rollout. So if you're interested, it's have a look at Energy for the People or the People's Solar. There are two websites there. We're about to launch demonstration projects in Mount Alexander Shire. The second thing I would quickly say...
20 seconds.
This is a different pitch, actually. So the different pitch is that we don't believe, we actually think that the tipping point is much closer than a lot of people who normally rely on government funding. We believe that it can be done without government funding. We actually believe that the metrics are there. And we are now looking to finding ways of supporting local communities such as Newstead, you've heard about, such as Yakandanda. There are a lot of communities that actually want to have their own power system. So we want to change the power distribution system. I'm coming to speak to you on the 14th of April about this. So that's very, very important. So let's not just look at it as renewables, let's look at it the next step beyond renewables in terms of both community agency and also in terms of getting scale to reduce greenhouse gases, because that's really the ultimate goal, but being pragmatic and using commercial processes rather than necessarily government funding. Okay, sorry, thank you for your time.
Very reasonable to regard those as two important but different pitches. We're probably coming to the close of our time, so
90 seconds.
yeah, go for it. So probably there, and Craig, I'll get you to say one or two quick things if you want to, and then I'll invite.
I'm a volunteer for Solar Citizens, and we want everybody to know that Solar Citizens is an organisation started by Dr. Evans in Sydney, and we've got 50,000 members at the moment. We've got the potential to get 500,000 members to speak on behalf of people who've got solar cells on their roofs. So if you want, we want everybody to be aware. I walk around my neighbourhood, people have got solar cells, they've never heard of us, so I give them a brochure and they go and click on and get that numbers up to 500,000 people if we can, and we'll have a lot more political clout, and therefore there'll be more jobs available as well. So that's all I've got to say.
Craig, did you want to say one or two quick things?
Yeah, a different comment to the one I put my hand up earlier for. I think
That's you're allowed to change your mind. Yep.
Yeah, but just on the topic of communities buying back the grid and doing, going off grid. So ATA and Energy for the People actually finished a very interesting research project recently where we looked at using today's technology at prices that are likely in the next few years, when it will be viable for communities to go off grid. And what we found was that under certain conditions, that's really close to happening now. And that presents, in terms of jobs, that was the third topic I was spoken about today. I had 12 minutes instead of 8. But,
We can have another forum on it.
in terms of jobs, there's potentially a vast amount of jobs there that can be done cost effectively and without, without pulling jobs out of the existing sector as well. Because supplying energy locally has a lot more of a jobs focus than an infrastructure focus, putting more money into people and less into the actual infrastructure side of it. And to make an off-grid community work, you need a lot of storage, you need a lot of solar systems. And if you've got a replicable model, you need a business that's developed, that's got an ESCO model to actually operate those. And if they can replicate that, then those become long-term jobs that have got a future to them, as opposed to car manufacturing.
Yep. Okay. Did you have? Is this going to be really short? Yep.
It's
really
just
short.
A very brief, short announcement that on the 27th of April we're doing an event in Geelong. It's about an hour by train from here, and I think a lot of you in this room would be interested. It's called Renew Geelong, and it's about renewables, but it's in a very informal way. It's not a trade fair or anything. We call it a picnic. It's an outdoor event, and it's a get-together where people can mingle. There'll be some tables, exhibitions and things like this in small scale. And we are groups of people in Geelong who want to start this kind of community-funded things that we're talking about here as well. So we are going to launch something on the day. So anybody interested, come and get a flyer.
And I'll use my chair's prerogative to do an ad as well for the talk that Mark Diesendorf, who many of you will know from University of New South Wales, is doing a talk and a book launch next Tuesday night on his new book, Sustainable Energy Solutions for Climate Change. So that'll be at 6 o'clock at 207 Bouverie Street, just round the corner from here. So if you're interested in that further discussion, please come along. I beg your pardon? Yes, it's Tuesday, the 8th of April at 6 o'clock. And if you go to the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute website, you'll find the details of that. Now, lastly, in the last 8.5 minutes, I'd like to introduce Lily D'Ambrosio, who is, as well as being the member for Mill Park, the Shadow Minister for Energy Resources and Cost of Living, to really give some concluding reflections, I guess, including, I imagine, on some thoughts that the opposition has in the lead up to the election. So I'll ask you to speak for about 7 or 8 minutes.
Yes, yeah, you tell me when. Okay. Thank you very much to all of you, and to John and Mark, Tim, Craig and Mike. And I've met with each and every one of you, some of you once, many of you, most of you probably more than 10 times. And I'll look at you advisedly, Tim and Mark and Craig to perhaps a lesser extent. But Mike, certainly I had the pleasure to come and visit you in your office about 18 months ago to have a talk about some of this stuff. But can I just say that the quick jobs angle is fascinating, especially when you consider the fact that it's quick jobs in a quickly changing world environment of renewable energy technologies. And we know that, and we only have to reflect on the fact that it was only probably about 5 to 7 years ago that the cost of solar PV panels were in the high teens in terms of thousands of dollars, and now we know that it's a far more accessible technology, which has been assisted very much so by a number of factors, including, of course, government regulation and feed-in tariffs that were a key driver of that, subsidies for panels, but also, of course, and we can't forget the fact of the role that China's played in actually driving down costs. So that's obviously abated the question of job creations in Victoria in terms of manufacturing, but has certainly helped boost jobs in installations, which have been very critical in supporting the industry in Victoria. If I may just do a bit of a quick touch on some of the comments that have been made by some of our expert speakers, but also make the important comment about the role and the place that consumers have in all of this. And Mike, you very much hit the nail on the head when you said that we need to start looking at technologies and the way that energy is generated, but also accessed or distributed and shared around from the prism of the needs of consumers, the end users, and that's really going to drive the way that the old delivery model, if you like, generation and delivery model will be looked at. But there is some hope in that, I think, and if I can perhaps just comment before I get on to the particular comments of job creation, is that I visited New Zealand last year, a very, very quick visit and a very purposeful one, and that is I went to visit a distribution business, an energy distribution business in Auckland, and I'll name them, they're Vector Energy, and this isn't a promotion for them, but simply to give you, I suppose, an understanding that some of these businesses, these traditional businesses, are understanding that their business as usual approach, their business as usual model of operating has got to change, and they're starting to understand that they've got to go down to where the consumer uses the energy and really turn on its head the way that they are able to, and how they distribute, how they deliver that energy, and look at ways of helping those consumers not just get PV panels on their roof, but also how they store it. So we're talking about household and community-based storage, but where the distribution business can change its business model to help finance that, so that there's a bit of a win both ways. And that's a very dynamic way, I think, of looking at it, and it's something that we really haven't come to terms with here in Australia, and I'm hoping that we can at some point, because that will help also, because there's lots of jobs that spin out from that, of course, which are very, very important. And all of that obviously needs to be looked at from the perspective of a major party that wants to become elected, to be able to do something, and do something that's tangible and meaningful in all of this, is that consumers need to feel as though they've got control back over what's going on in their lives. And gone are the days, and we know that, gone are the days when energy was seen as anything more than just something you got on your bill at the end of, either a gas bill every 2 months or a gas bill every 3 months. And it was no more than really a blip in the way that the household considered energy and their use and the cost of energy. But we know pricing, of course, has forced consumers to see it very differently. and the rapid uptake of some of the technologies has given a bit of an opening for consumers to get a little bit more control over it, but we've still got a hell of a long way to go on that front. And importantly, we need to make sure that we're able to ride the wave of changing technologies and not miss it, because at the moment we've basically got the surfboard out in the water, and I'm not a surfer. I sort of balk at big waves, but let alone know how to get on a board. But the reality is, as was quite rightly said, I mean, there's $36 billion of investment and jobs that have been signalled as being available through investment in Australia by 2020. And some of that investment's come Victoria's way, but a lot of it's been stalled, and we know that. We know that wind energy has been put on the back burner for ridiculous ideological, aesthetic reasons. And we know, though, that the next big problem that we've got is what's going to happen with the renewable energy target federally, because that will crunch. That has the potential of actually crushing. And I say this word not I think, in a dramatic sense, because I think it is a reality that it will have the potential to actually crush the wind energy industry, and any hope that the state in Victoria may actually recover its advantage that it did have at one point. So that's very important to actually have some advocacy from a state perspective to be able to keep that alive as a very, very important mechanism, not the only mechanism, but a very, very important mechanism. Because at the moment, we know that even in Dennis Snapthine's own backyard, that he's suffering, a spike in unemployment. And, last week he was quoted in his local papers not really understanding why that's happened. Well, hello, anyone knows that the natural advantage of that part of Victoria, the natural resources that Victoria has, combined with the knowledge, the advantage for Victoria of the knowledge base in wind energy generation has just been stalled. And we had a perfect opportunity with someone who's got a passion, a declared passion for wind energy, and yet not the courage to be able to do something with that by having overturned very, very bad and ridiculous, laughable planning laws that we've had. Now, I know you're going to hurry me out. So concessions budgets and financing models are very, very important. When we start to accept that we've got to look at energy technologies from a consumer demand perspective, that automatically opens up opportunities, but certainly the space for us to need to be more clever and more nimble and flexible in the financing options that are available to consumers to be able to get access to those technologies that are emerging and new and evolving at very, very rapid rates. Some are. And so we need to certainly be, and I know that we're very keen as an opposition to look at opportunities for us, hopefully from a government perspective, to promote financing models that actually make those technologies more readily available, so that you've got the jobs that come out of that, which is very, very important. Some businesses out there are more attuned to that, are more sensitive to that. Others will have to be probably dragged to that. Some of those traditional businesses, that is the generation and the distribution end, and even some retailers. And we know the link between generation and retailing is quite strong, where there's a complete tie-up to an extent of more than 70% in Victoria at least of those two elements. So very keen to keep talking offline even. And so I know, John, you're looking at me advisedly because I've gone over, probably by about 3 minutes. But certainly feed-in tariffs, we were on that a few years ago, and even as long as 18 months ago, we were still wondering, what is a fair feed-in tariff? I would say, without suggesting that that shouldn't be revisited, and that's not what I'm suggesting at all, but we have now got to move to how do people actually use their energy that they generate, how can they store it, and how can they access it to help on that front. But certainly a fair tariff and what that means, and also of course what it means for generations that are not small, that are the middle range, needs some certain thinking and addressing by governments through regulations at least. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and greatly appreciate it.
In a second, I'm going to ask you to thank all our speakers, but I think what tonight has highlighted is the array of possibilities, the array of opportunities. When we, at the beginning, we talked about really there being two drivers of the discussion tonight. One is the challenge of climate change and the need to think differently about energy demand and supply from a point of view of addressing climate change. But of course, the second reason for tonight was highlighting the great economic and employment opportunities of thinking differently about how we produce and distribute energy in this state. And I think the speakers together tonight have provided a host of food for thought. I think I'd like to particularly congratulate the Clean Energy Council and Environment Victoria for organising the forum. There's, I think, clearly a thirst and a huge appetite for these discussions to continue. So I'm sure this will not be the last of these discussions. I'm sure there'll be many to come, and we look forward to contributing to those as well. So to conclude, I'd like you to thank all our speakers very much, and wish you well for the evening.